Good evening and welcome back to the meeting. We will now have the Finance and Operations Committee in-person and virtual meeting for June 20th, 2023. Before we call tonight's meeting to order, Dr. McGarry, will you please remind us and outline the public's participation procedure, sir?
Yes, Board President Brown. A couple ways to participate. In-person individuals, after all the presentations are made, are able to come to the microphone, provide their name and address and a specific item on the agenda they'd like to comment on or ask a question. For committee meetings, especially the Finance and Operations, questions can be asked. The board can answer those questions or assign those questions to an administrator this evening. And we'll do our best to answer those questions before the board decides to move any item forward for a vote at another meeting or following this evening's meeting. People that are virtual, provide your name, address, and you can send it into board or committee questions at upwardrbsd.org or 610-789-7200, extension 2000. Again, identify the specific item on a specific agenda, and you can ask your question. We'll take that in consideration. Following the meeting for Finance and Operations, there'll be a special voting meeting. And at that time, it's comment only, and I'll definitely go through how to participate in that meeting at that time.
Thank you, Dr. McGarry. The meeting of the Finance and Operations Committee will please come to order. The district posted this evening's agenda to board docs at least 24 hours prior to the commencement of this meeting. Is there a motion to approve that previously posted agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Are there any amendments to offer?
There are no amendments.
Thank you. The agenda has been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, please signify by saying aye opposed and state your name for the record. Those abstaining, please signify by saying I abstain and state your name for the record. The motion carried. I will now turn over the Finance and Operations Committee to Co-Chair Director Ward Savage.
Thank you very much, President Brown. Mr. Rogers, if you wouldn't mind, please begin with an overview of your agenda items for this evening, and you can go right into the first presentation, please.
Sure. Tonight we have 3 agenda items. The first agenda item is the 2023-2024 final budget presentation, which will require board action. We will review in compliance with the Act 1 timeline and present the budget in its final form. The final general fund budget has taken all available and relevant information into consideration at this time and is presented with a 1% tax increase. The second item is a request to name a school district facility, which will also require board action. The district administration with the board will discuss a request that we had received to name the Aronimink Library. The administration will ask the board to consider the request and provide guidance on how they would like to proceed. The third item is Policy 707, Use of School Facilities Update. Again, board action. The board will provide an update on the most recent user group meeting that was held by administration. The board will provide an overview of the topics and potential solutions that were discussed. Based on the information presented, the board will be asked how they would like to move forward with the current policy and procedures. With that said, we'll jump right into the first presentation, and that's the final budget presentation. So again, tonight we'll be discussing the 2023-24 final budget. First, we'll discuss the Act 1 timeline as it's gotten us to this point. So over the past few months, you can see the timeline laid out on the presentation. November 22nd was the first portion of the Act 1 timeline, where we discussed at the November committee meeting the option of a preliminary budget versus an accelerated opt-out, and noted that our base index was 4.1% and our adjusted index for the district was 6% for this upcoming school year, the 23-24 school year. December 6th, the board approved a resolution not to exceed 6% and choosing to go down the accelerated opt-out resolution path for the 23-24 fiscal year. April 25th, we provided a committee meeting presentation on the proposed final budget. On May 9th, the board adopted the proposed final budget, and at that time, it was made available for public inspection on PDE Form 2028. On June 7th, the district published a notice of intent to adopt the final budget this evening. So tonight, June 20th, after the presentation and we close the Finance and Operations Committee meeting, the board will vote on a resolution to adopt the final budget. And as I stated, it's immediately following this committee meeting. And I also just want to state that based on the Act 1 timeline, the district has to adopt a budget no later than June 30th. So again, in review, in line with all of our previous presentations, this slide here shows historically the district's tax increase from year to year in conjunction with the base index and the adjusted index. So you can see in yellow what was actually approved by the board, and in most cases staying at or just below the base index from one year to the next. And we usually point out on this slide, back in 2016-17, the idea of we actually had a 0% tax increase all the way back in 2016-17. And then from that point forward on this next slide, you can see what the impact was to the actual assigned fund balance to bounce the budget. So when you look again at the left to right, you can see in 2015-16, the year prior to that 0%, the district was using $2.5 million to bounce its budget. You see a $4 million jump in use of fund balance in that year of a 0% tax increase. From that year up until the current this current iteration of the final budget for 23-24, the district has strived to actually bring that use of fund balance back down to a manageable rate. So what has always been in our budget is an acceptable amount of use of fund balance that is actually associated with staffing timing issues. So if you have staff or come and go throughout the year, there is a timing issue where it takes so much time to be able to fill a position, and in our current environment, there's a actual national staffing shortage of teachers, so it's made it even harder. So that's why, not only with cost of living increases, but from 2015-16 at $2.5 million of use of fund balance to this current final budget for 23-24 school year at a $4.1 million use of fund balance, that dollar amount is directly tied to what's in our budgetary reserves in the budget that it was calculated off a 10-year average of where we typically stand in unfilled positions throughout the year. And when I say unfilled positions, it's not because we want them to be unfilled. We try and we push as hard as we can to make sure we staff all of our positions throughout the year. We never stop trying to hire, but it's just the reality of the situation that we do have turnover throughout the year. And we've continued to experience that. But I will say that this iteration of the budget that we're presenting tonight is the healthiest that we've had from a budgetary perspective in how we're actually situated to go in the next year. And again, that is budgeting at 100% staffing. So that's where, let's call it $4.2 million roughly. What we feel comfortable is where it would project to somewhere come in. So this is, for Upper Darby, what would be considered a balanced budget. So here are some of the budget assumptions as of tonight. We are coming out, and the proposed final budget that was approved in May was a 2.25% tax increase. We were able to bring the percentage down to a 1% tax increase and improve the overall bottom line of the budget. Again, just to reiterate, the board and the school district, even with an opt-out, accelerated opt-out, was committed to keeping it below 6%. We are not allowed to increase taxes above 6%, I'm sorry. So we came in well below that at 1%, and we'll discuss some of the things that are actually still included in this budget. The next line here shows that this budget is based off of 100% of the governor's proposed budget from March of 2023. Now, I point that out because the previous budget iteration, the proposed final budget, was at 75%, because in many years there's not a high level of confidence that we're going to get what's actually proposed in that first stage of budgeting. Unlike some of the previous years, there's actually already been communication out as of last week that the House actually submitted a revised budget that actually increases the funding beyond what the governor's proposal was. With that knowledge in hand and not knowing whether or not that is going to be realized, it gave us a little level of security that we felt that we could go to 100% on the originally proposed from March state funding. So we did move up to 100% with a plan to be able to adjust accordingly if it comes in above or below what we are budgeting. So in that 100% of the governor's proposed budget, the basic ed funding, which has level up consolidated into the basic ed this current year's level up was folded into the basic ed funding formula. Turns out to be a $5.57 million increase. The special ed funding increases by $1.31 million. The budget that will be voted on tonight also includes the bond issuance for capital projects, most specifically associated with the Clifton Heights Middle School project. It also includes $25.58 million in ESSER funding. We updated our preliminary title allocations, which actually turned out to be just under $800,000 of an increase to the federal funding, which was used to allocate across how we were budgeting staffing and a few other areas within the budget to help improve the overall bottom line of the budget. This other item that, to me is pretty important is a facility improvement budget of $10.5 million. So in years past, we had always budgeted for, trying to build up our capital reserve, and it was the best we could do. We would put 0.5% into the budget. It would go over to the capital reserve to make sure that if we ever had a rainy day, essentially a rainy day fund, that if we ever had a major emergency with a breakdown in equipment, we would have those funds there. We're continuing to do that as a prudent budget practice. But in addition to that, we recently received our facilities condition assessment report that showed that in the next 2 years, we have roughly $20 million in improvements that need to be made to our internal buildings. And what I mean by that, that's not $20 million associated with a renovation or addition to a building or a new middle school or a new elementary school. That is just our existing equipment and facilities as they stand currently. They have to be improved. There are many different areas that we have a lot of room for improvement, but this budget is actually allowing for $10.5 million in the general fund to be used on those projects that have come from the facilities assessment report that we received. So when speaking to that, here are some of the upcoming facility improvements. And some of these are going to look familiar, some are not. Some have been already approved by the board, or contracts have come through for approval by the board. What I'll say is the ones that have not already received formal board approval at a voting meeting, we plan, in order to kind of review them here real quick, these are slated to be done over this summer or just after, but they are included in the budget. So voting on the budget by the board, all of these items are being explored and will be executed unless there were some circumstance where it was deemed to be moved in a different direction. So many of these you may actually see in the facilities report, the supplies report, finance and budget report in August as retroactive approvals due to a timing situation. We only have so much time to work on our facilities when students aren't in the buildings. So, you will see a lot of this work being done over the course of the summer and the fall. So just to go through quickly, on the left-hand side, you'll see what we classify as district-wide projects. And what I mean by that is when I say exterior lighting upgrades, it's district-wide. We're evaluating across the entire district. It does not mean that every single exterior light will be changed out necessarily, but it's not that it's just one building, where some of these projects are very specific to the building. So again, exterior lighting upgrade, exterior door replacement and repairs, shrub removal, stairwell refresh project, so the flooring in our stairwells in the buildings and paint, fence replacement and repair, informational and directional signage refresh, the building level marquee replacements, preventative maintenance program upgrade, and the aged TVs that exist throughout our district that have been discussed many times in somewhat of a joking fashion are actually going to be removed, patch the walls, and take the tube TVs that are actually hung in the corners of many of our classrooms in many of our buildings will be removed. As we usher in clear touch boards, we can get rid of the tube TVs that are hanging on the walls. At the secondary level, the high school boiler room equipment replacement, which we can thank for the temperature in the room tonight. That process has already started. So we are working through that, and we'll continue to work through it this summer. The auditoria upgrades, which we've discussed in the past and will continue to discuss, phase one, the lighting, sound, and rigging has been discussed rather often, and that project is already underway and being worked on. Phase two will be coming over the course of the next year, which includes the seating, flooring, and paint in all secondary schools, Beverly Hills, Drexel Hill, and the high school. The high school track and field replacement is underway right now. If you were to drive by, you can see that the field has been, pulled back, and they are working through that with hopes of having the field prepared and ready for the beginning of September and the track to follow shortly after. We have the Drexel Hill Middle School locker room upgrade that will continue to be explored, and we're working on that. That is actually going to be funded through ESSER. The high school front parking lot replacement had been discussed previously. Due to some timing constraints and issues, we had to move it off of this summer and plan to do that going in the next year, in the next summer. And then additionally, athletic field improvements, generally speaking, for the secondary schools. This isn't specific so much just to the actual school location, but district-wide. Our athletic programs use fields throughout all of our district-owned facilities, from Hillcrest to 8201 actually had a softball field out back. All of those, we are looking at all of those fields and determining what can we do to improve them so that we can better utilize them as a district and a community. So 8201 is a great example. It was used as somewhat of a construction setup while working on 8201. So there were shipping containers and equipment on the field. As soon as all of that is moved out, we will be looking to reface the field and work towards it being an operational district athletic facility. Next is a review of the staffing additions that's been in all the previous presentations. I will say the one addition, or I could say two additions. The fourth bullet on the left-hand side, high school counselors. We plan to add 2 high school counselors based on a meeting that we recently had about scheduling and how we're moving into the next year. The hope is that the additional counselors will be able to help create flexibility in the schedule and give us the ability to be a little bit more creative in how we flow through the year and can work with the ebbs and flows of our scheduling and anything that may change from now till the start of school. So to review the actual numbers, you have here the 22-23, our current school year final budget, in comparison to the 23-24 final budget. As we've discussed in the past, when you look at this, the revenues are actually presented net of the tax increase. So you can see if you were to go with a 0% tax increase, what would that actually look like? And then we add in where the actual tax increase comes in at that 1%. So quickly, you could see the total revenue net, the tax increase would be $264.5 million, with expenditures just under $270 million, leaving expenditures exceeding revenues of almost $3 million. 1% tax increase will add almost $1.1 million in revenue, bringing that the committed fund, the fund balance committed to bounce the budget to just below $4.2 million, which is a slight improvement over the current year's use of fund balance to bounce the 22-23 budget. At a 1% tax, this would what it looks like for an annual impact on taxpayers. So left to right, you can see different assessments, anywhere from $50,000 of a home assessment to a $350,000 assessment. At 1%, that's anywhere from an additional $12 above and beyond your current year taxes, the 22 tax year, all the way up to $87 on the higher end for a $350,000 assessment. And just to review where we are as of this moment, again, we'll ask the board to vote to adopt a resolution for the final budget immediately following this meeting. And should there be, for any reason, have the vote not go through, we just have to keep in mind that the budget absolutely has to be passed no later than June 30th. So at this time, I can field any questions from the board.
Thank you very much once again for not only a very detailed presentation, but bringing that percentage down that we're going to have to ask the public to take on, that tax increase of only 1%. I just think that's stellar. So let's take it around the board. Does anyone have any comments or concerns? President Brown?
I just had one clarifying question on Chart 8. You talked about the guidance counselors that are being added. I'm sorry, the high school counselors that are being added. You said it was one more that wasn't. Perhaps I missed it. It was one more.
So when I said that there was an additional position added to the slide,
Oh.
it's 2. So
Got it. I thought you meant two
There-
categories. Got it.
Yep.
Got
So
it. Got it. Got it.
2 high school counselors were added to this slide.
Thank you, sir. Got it.
I did have one question for the administration. would any kind of opening up of PlanCon seriously change the game in terms of how we're planning the budget? Is that even on the radar? Like, how are we gaming for that?
Yeah, well, as I was invited by Senator Kearney to go speak, I just got an email to ask to speak on Friday at something, so I'm going to ask to talk to Board President Brown and Vice President Fields about that in Philadelphia. But PlanCon, remember, the issue with PlanCon is that your projects had to be through that process for them to be approved. So currently, our facilities projects, because PlanCon has been sunset, it's not turned back on, none of our school construction projects would be able to be used for PlanCon. Future projects, such as potentially, if PlanCon were to be turned on right now, we might be able to get Clifton Heights involved in that, and the new elementary school. And if Craig Harnachek has his way, he wants to try to do another high school somewhere in the district. I don't know how we're going to do that. But unfortunately, our current facilities projects, because PlanCon was not turned on, are not able to be a part of that process. It would be moving forward, if it got turned on quickly, it would be for Clifton Heights potentially and for a new elementary school. That would save us millions of dollars just on those two projects alone. But Aronimink, 8201, those projects would not be PlanCon eligible.
And a quick follow-up to that, would there be any kind of advocacy, Dr. McGarry, that you'd be able to give for consideration to the community, like how they should go about advocating for these dollars? That would be of really good use to us.
Yeah, I'll try to push out that communication where I testified last month on PlanCon and the need for PlanCon and funding and how much we could have saved and we could save moving forward. But one of my questions was the infrastructure bill and considering roads, bridges, and schools in a similar vein. As a country, considering public schools and their facilities the same way we treat road improvements, bridge improvements, and other infrastructural improvements, I think public schools should be considered the same exact way. And community-wise, it's very hard to do that on your own, to raise those taxes without that funding. The original PlanCon funding was a smart way to say, we're investing in public education in the facilities. And when that went away, obviously the amount of money school districts have to face right now to fix that is problematic. So I would say that right now, if you can reach out to state representatives or Senator Kearney's office and ask them to advocate to fund, one of the considerations that they're talking about is how to make improvements for current facilities from an upkeep standpoint as a new qualifier as a House bill. So there's some consideration to not just do PlanCon, but also not to see older buildings get totally torn down, and how can you keep them up, because there may not be enough money to do it all at one time for everybody. But I do think there needs to be consideration of looking at how infrastructure and public education is funded similar to improving roads and bridges and highways in the Commonwealth.
Alrighty, any other feedback from board members before we go to the next agenda item? All right, seeing none, I think we are ready for the second agenda item.
The next agenda item is the request to name a school district facility. The board and the administration received a request to rename the Aronimink Library. Based on board policy, we had to bring that request forward to the committee, and the chairs of the committee wanted to bring it to this meeting so that the board can hear the request and give consideration.
All right, so the way that I envisioned having this was just to have a conversation again about the application and read aloud the testimony that this person wrote to a very beloved teacher, and then see what the board feels about how we can best honor that request. And then perhaps at the very end, see if it's up for maybe for the policy liaisons to consider if there's an opportunity to maybe amend how we take a look at how we do rename facilities or the frequency in which we do that. Maybe just see how this conversation goes. So I'm going to open it up by just reading the testimony that the community member had shared. It's also available on board docs. To say that Bill Bambrick was a beloved teacher at Aronimink Elementary School would be an understatement. For many years, he created a classroom environment that fostered curiosity and a love of learning. To this day, many of his students, some more than 30 years removed from his room in 201, still reminisce over how impactful he was in our lives. Some of us cite him as the reason we became teachers in the first place. As one of those former students, I can remember the excitement and anticipation of being in Mr. Bambrick's class. Started early, in second and in third grade, as we saw the big fifth grade students rave about the mummy walk, the egg drop, and the penultimate learning event, the voyage of the Mimi. That anticipation was not for nothing, because it did become our time to spend that glorious year with Mr. Bambrick, and it was everything that we hoped it would be, but not because of those fun events, but because there was something that is so critical to a classroom: love. The love that Mr. Bambrick had for learning, for discovery, and most importantly, his students, was present and apparent every day that we spent with him. That love was reciprocated tenfold by his students. That love didn't end when we left Aronimink. I remember so many back-to-school nights when I was in high school and standing in a line that stretched out of his classroom and down the hall with the students and families, both past and present, who would wait in line just for a few minutes of his time just to say hello and give thanks for being such a positive force in our lives. As time has moved on, we have lost the opportunity to tell him how much he has meant to us. But I believe, as many of my fellow alumni do, that renaming the new Aronimink Elementary School Library after Bill Bambrick would be a lasting, permanent way to honor his memory and the love that many of us continue to hold for him. Signed, Allison Izevich. All right, so how does the board feel, initial thoughts from the board based on that testimony and the application that was filled out? It does serve, just for, so everyone is aware, I did have an informal conversation with this gentleman to just set the parameters and expectations. I did ask him up front if it ended up being the will of the board to say, direct the administration to have a conversation to memorialize Bill Bambrick in a different way, would he be open to that? He did say yes, but he wants to see, he would appreciate us having this conversation and seeing where the board lands on it. So, comments? Director Mitchell?
This might be for Dr. McGarry or Craig. Isn't the Aronimink Library currently previously named after a teacher? I feel like we did that, at least in my tenure. Who is it named after?
Yes, there was
and why?
there was it was a big deal made of the naming of Aronimink Elementary School library after the librarian Kate Dostoevsky.
It was just within the past 4 years or so, or maybe 5. I'm not sure.
It's been longer than 5, but within the last 10.
Yeah, and I think that's very moving, and it sounds like Mr. Bambrick was an amazing teacher. And I know just recently we had a conversation about renaming of the Performing Arts Center, and we settled on, memorializing their contribution with a plaque, and it's a very nice plaque, and I would recommend that going forward. I know we had talked about that at that time, talking about the naming of school facilities, and maybe we weren't going to be moving forward with that much longer. So we should probably put it in the policy, line up to look at. But I would love to memorialize Mr. Bambrick. I think it's great, but I think it may be with a plaque. Especially since the library has already been named after the librarian that's had an incredible impact at Aronimink. We have so many fabulous teachers. We're really a fortunate district.
Just to clarify the naming of the Aronimink Library, I've been on the board since December 2017, and the Aronimink Library has been named during my time on the board. I support memorializing this beloved teacher in some way. I would prefer it to be in another manner than renaming a facility that's already been named.
So I grew up here, but my wife and I lived in Montgomery County before we bought our house in Drexel Hill in Aronimink School District. And so we moved, our oldest son, he moved out of a school up in Montgomery County to Aronimink. And Mr. Bambrick was his teacher, his first year at Aronimink. Mr. Bambrick had a great joke that I stole, which is that we both dye our hair gray, which is, it takes a while for people to figure that out, but the kids never figured it out. They thought it was awesome that he dyed his hair gray. So, so we had him. He helped my oldest with that adjustment because you go from one school to another, middle of the year, new school year. It's an adjustment, and he was a big help with that. And I think the letter really does a great job of memorializing him. We did in my tenure, which is since 2018. I feel like we just renamed that library for the librarian that worked there for a long time. So I second Director Mitchell's preference for a plaque of some sort to memorialize him. I also second the desire to relook at this particular policy, as I feel as we build facilities and as we improve facilities, there's going to be more requests to rename pieces after people. And there's a limited amount of space, and I do not enjoy hurting people's feelings, at least not publicly. So I think that would be a better strategy and policy going forward. So, so I'm going to go on record saying to the policy committee, if we could bring that up and change that so that it better fits what we're able to do here in the district and on the board. Okay, but Mr. Bamberg was an incredible teacher, and my son had him when he retired, and that year he had to retire in the middle of the year, and we made a big gift. He was a huge impact, and he was a really good teacher, and that's the thing about great teachers, and especially teachers in this district. You remember them forever. For me, it's Mr. Yost, 7th grade science, right? I'm always happy to see him, right? So many years later. So, and we have great teachers here. I'll second that as well. Thank you.
This question is for administration. As we continue to talk about and discuss ways to memorialize people, and as we've redone playgrounds, aren't there areas that we could look at, and maybe playgrounds like memorial benches or some other way to also memorialize people other than just a whole facility? Not that it's not worthy, but I'm just saying, like, there's other ways, maybe.
Yeah, yes. In my opinion, I think, especially in the current environment of today, naming facilities after individuals, as we've learned over the last couple of years, becomes concerning over time. I think honoring people maybe with trees or benches or things like that can be planted are also ways to honor somebody. But I think naming facilities outside of community names, I think, as we've learned historically, doesn't often stand the test of time. And that would be a concern moving forward.
Yeah, I think Director Mitchell said it best, and to Don's additional comments. I think we have a path forward. We want to respect all of the talent that we've had over the years, and I think we'll have a lot more moving forward. And I think the plaques, tastefully done, goes a long way towards acknowledging people's incredible contributions to our district, and doing it uniformly, so we're not taking up, renaming all of our facilities after different people, because I think we're going to have a lot more talent coming our way. And plaques are smaller, and we can put multiple plaques in a building because there's a lot of talent that contributes greatly to multiple buildings, and plaques allow us to do that in a smaller footprint, but tastefully done and acknowledging their contributions.
Very aptly put. Any other feedback from board members? Oh, one other piece of information from me, in full disclosure, I also had Bill Bambrick when I was in 5th grade, him and Eileen Lynch. Bill Bambrick was also the person responsible for putting together Aroniming's first computer club with Joanna Mulholland back in the mid-1990s. I don't want to give away how old I really am, since I look young right now. And Bill Bambrick also kept students busy after school with model planes from World War II. We would put them together, get them from the dollar store, and do different animal creations with clay and stuff like that. Like, I'm turning on my kid brain, and I'm like, yeah, okay, got to get back down to business. All right.
Did he dye his hair gray back then?
Yes.
He did? Okay.
All right. I think we are ready to move on to the third agenda item for this evening.
So the third agenda item is the presentation on the policy on policy 707, use of school facilities, to provide an update on the most recent user group meeting. At this time, I'll hand it over to Director Desnoyers.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. This presentation follows a presentation given about the use of facilities process by administration at the May Finance and Operations Committee meeting. So at that time, it was discussed that that administration would organize a meeting for youth group leaders to discuss concerns after the use of facilities policy was updated last fall. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Tonight's presentation, we have overview and goals. We have a quick review of the custodial fee calculation, a summary of the youth group meeting held by administration, which I attended, some available options for the board to consider. Next is which will be followed by a board discussion where the board will discuss the options presented and potentially develop additional options and discuss them. And then the final item is wrap up and next steps. So the overview and goals, the board has received feedback on policy 707, use of facilities on the custodial fee charges. This feedback follows updates enacted at the November 22nd, 2022 board meeting and concerns custodial fee charges for the winter 2022-2023 season. The purpose of this presentation is to outline potential actions the board may take. The board will then discuss options and come to consensus on what, if any, action it would like to take. As a reminder, Policy 707, use of facilities, establishes conditions, restrictions, and procedures for the use of facilities for non-school sponsored purposes. In November 2022, the board updated Policy 707 to waive rental fees for youth groups. Around that time, fees were set for custodial. The district began charging custodial fees when staff needed to come to and open up school facilities for users. The board is considering a limited set of potential changes to Policy 707. The purpose of tonight's presentation and discussion is for the board to decide if it wishes to take any action on Policy 707 custodial fees, and if so, the action it wishes to take. So, calculation of custodial fee charges. The district generally charges $17.03 per hour for a recreation custodian. If a custodian needs to be on duty specifically and solely to staff a rental use. So, in brief, I just wanted to mention that if two or more groups use a facility, and this is the second item on this slide, if two or more groups use a facility simultaneously, the custodial fee for that block of time is split among the groups using the facility. So a summary of the youth group leaders meeting. The purpose of it was to allow youth group leaders to discuss concerns about custodial fee charges and brainstorm potential ways concerns can be arisen. As noted, the concerns came about because the winter 2022-2023 season was the first time youth athletic groups have been charged significant fees for using district facilities. The attendees at that meeting were members of the administration, youth group leaders, and a board representative, which was myself. The primary concerns voiced during that meeting were total custodial fee charges for the winter 2022-2023 season and future winter seasons, and that is because use of athletic fields and other outdoor facilities don't typically incur custodial fee charges. So the two concerns are the custodial fee charges and the lack of timely billing of custodial fees. There were different options discussed in the youth group leaders meeting. The first was youth group representatives can be hired by the district as recreation custodians. The administration has offered this for some time, but it has not been well utilized by youth groups. It was noted during the youth group leaders meeting that this option presents an issue because the thought behind the district offering this ability was that the youth group representatives being paid as recreation custodians could essentially donate the funds to the youth group to pay the custodial fee charges. And what was mentioned at the youth group leaders meeting was that the youth group representative is paid $17.03 an hour as a recreation custodian, but then gets taxes, etc., withheld from their paycheck. So the net paycheck is less than what the district is charging the youth group. The second item discussed was the possibility of youth groups better coordinating the scheduling of their representatives who are serving as recreation custodians, and this was very well supported among youth group leaders. And then the last item to address the timeliness issue, at the youth group leaders meeting and then in a subsequent email conversation between a representative of the board and representatives of administration, it has been proposed that estimated bills can be issued prior to or at the start of the season or year for 75% of the prior year's actual charge, and then this would allow differences between estimated and actual bills for a given season or year. They would be reconciled at the end of the season or year. So the above three options do not require board action on Policy 707. And then just a note, although not specifically discussed at the youth group meeting, at least one board member has voiced support for waiving typical and normal custodial fees for youth groups. So the available options. The three options that don't require board action, and then options that do require board action, the board can recommend that the administration implement any of the three above options. The board can recommend that administration reduce custodial fees, and the board can waive typical and normal custodial fees. So now the board gets a chance to discuss which, if any, of these options it would like to pursue. So with that said, I'll open it up for comments and questions and, importantly, suggestions of additional options.
I guess it's just an overarching question. Did everyone come away with a general consensus that whatever we decide at this junction or soon thereafter is going to be pretty much the end note on this piece until at which point we want to review this again? And I'm speaking on two paths. One, we have a lot of things that we have to go through and consider and all that kind of thing and prioritize. This happens to be something that we've attempted to address quite a few times in short order. And I'm also thinking about the event curators, those who don't complain, those who follow the rules, those who just want to be given a straightforward, what's up for me this coming year, what do I have to plan for, some kind of consistency. So if you could give any clarity on that.
At the end of the youth group leaders meeting, it was discussed that another such meeting between youth group leaders, administration, and possibly a board representative would be scheduled. And the youth group leaders readily agreed to attend such a future meeting. It was not discussed or mentioned that this would be the last action, the last time the board considers policy 707.
Because sorry, just to addendum to my comment, because I'm also thinking of the other, again, event curators who aren't taking part in these conversations. And I'm sure that they would be able to make an argument to say, I think I have a viewpoint that really needs to be considered because this, that, and the third group don't necessarily speak to my constituency that I have a platform and a voice for. So I'm just wondering, where is this going to end, or how are we going to even make this even more equitable? Like how deep is this going to go?
So I neglected to mention that a minority of youth group leaders who attended the youth group leader meeting expressed a concern about total custodial fee charges. I think I'll ask Mr. Rogers and Dr. McGarry to correct me if I'm wrong. So there were, I seem to remember 9 or 10 youth group leaders, approximately. If anybody
I can give you the update right now.
in the neighborhood.
Sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Around 10.
Okay. So that, so I hope that provides some information.
I just want to remind everyone that we did recently update the definition of a youth group, and that's the group that we're talking about in regards to this discussion, correct? If we were to waive the fees, Mr. Rogers, I'm wondering what will happen if a group schedules a building multiple times and does not, we've hired a custodian and they don't come to use it. What could it be that we waive the fees if they if they use the facility? I'm just trying to think logistically. I'm concerned about waiving the fees altogether because we would be hiring staff and using taxpayer dollars to do that. And if they were, a group would be consistently not showing up for the time that they've scheduled, what will we do?
The conversation surrounding the idea of, booking the facility through Facilitron, having it scheduled that you're to be there, and not communicating back to the district through the process that you were no longer going to need that site was absolutely discussed. We've experienced times where there, depending on how you look at it, maybe a breakdown in communication from one side or the other, or not following a procedure that was put in place. And we've sent our custodians or employees to buildings to unlock them, only to realize that the group was not there. Maybe they had to cancel practice, whatever it may be, and it was never communicated back. So that would be a possibility that there's a sunk cost and nobody using the facility. That did occur, and I think that was part of the conversation at the last meeting, the meeting we held, as well as publicly. The idea that could we even look back and kind of realize, look, this is when we actually used it. Here's what you're billing for. Like, is there any consideration of meeting somewhere, at what we actually used it? And moving forward, we'll make sure that we work through the process of communicating, if a practice were to be canceled or something along those lines.
There's a misunderstanding. I think the youth groups, not affiliated or not like loosely affiliated, but not more of the public school related groups, think that their tax dollars are funding a custodian 24/7. And so in that conversation, they thought, why are we being double charged? There was a misunderstanding that there are not custodians working those hours. And so when that conversation come up, I think there was a better understanding that when we send a custodian there, it's time and a half, it's overtime. They're union, and we've got to be careful that you can't contract out those services because they're a union. So some of the solutions I think that folks think are so simple and so easy, when you're taking work away or perceived as taking work away and contracting those hours out, you've got to be careful how we do that and when you're operating with unions. And custodians are members of a collective bargaining group.
The recreational custodians are as well, Dr. McGarry? Thank you.
I just was going to piggyback off of what Rachel said. If I go to the doctor and I don't cancel within 24 hours, I'm charged anywhere between $35 and $75 for non-cancellation fee. I don't think we should get to the point where we wait. If they keep canceling, I think for every occurrence that they do not cancel within a certain time period, they should be charged the fees.
I certainly think we should look at the custodial fees, and because I do think it's out of whack. I think I publicly stated that a number of times. I think the goal is to not make it cost prohibitive so that people don't even try to reserve our buildings, or we make it so that programs that have been around forever aren't being able to be done because now the fees are such that they can't charge the family something that they can't afford, or they just decide to not run the program. So I think my question to Mr. Rogers, because one of the options is to waive the fees altogether, or at least reduce the fees. Either one of those has a financial impact. So my question to you as our CFO is, what's that? Give me a sense of that financial impact, because I think at the last meeting, it was I think Marvin said it was a $93,000 or $97,000 total. That was, I think that was the total amount of custodial fees for the year, or to date, something to that nature. It was a fee that he came up with. So I'm just trying to understand that total number and the impact.
I have it, Craig, if you're finished.
Yeah.
So just for the custodial fees for that winter season, it was $95,000 cost for the district and $48,000 charged. So we are giving a substantial discount at the $17 rate to cover the custodial fees, but the total cost is over $100,000 and $48,325 charged. So a rough estimate is $100,000 is the cost.
Okay, so is that something that we could eat in like if this board decided to cover those costs, period, what will be the effect on our overall budget? I mean, 95,000 or whatever.
So in the numbers that Dan just gave the example, that was slide 13 of May's presentation.
Mm-hmm.
The 48,000 is what was billed. So if you were to waive fees completely in this scenario, you would be foregoing $48,000 on the revenue side of things. Those expenses exist no matter what. So we incurred over $95,000 in expenses. The district had to pay our employees. It's higher than what was billed at the $17 billing rate, because we can't always fill an event with a recreation custodian. So we charge for 17, which is actually the hourly rate for a recreation custodian. It's lower than 17, but it also adds in the fringe benefit side that the district picks up. So that's where that net piece comes. And then on top of that, obviously, the IRS is going to charge you tax, state, and your net pay comes down just like anything else. But the reason why it was more of a cost to the district is operationally, we're committing to the board's policy. We're charging at $17, but we have to have someone there to open that building. So if I can't get a recreation custodian, then I'm sending an actual custodian, to Dr. McGarry's point of it being time and a half. The dollar amount goes up. There's times where the cost really, at times, isn't even baked into this because an administrator may be going, and it doesn't charge the district any more money because we're salaried employees. But we're going out to cover it because someone has to be there. We've committed, and the board approved the use of the facility. We got to make sure that they can use the facility appropriately. You know, and that comparison of who's actually covering it, the $95,000, the actual true cost of the district is much higher than that if you really start factoring all the time and effort that goes into it. And I'll say,
What would you
that-
say that figure is? Just, I mean, I know it's hard to estimate, or because I want to go on what number you say, because my next question is going to be, with the exception of people that book the facility and don't use it, because I agree that we should charge them for that. Other than that, what is the impact if this board decides to cover those fees, if the district decides to cover those costs and not charge them? I want to know what the effect is. Yeah, I'm sorry.
After the youth group leaders meeting, our controller, Mr. Lee, when questioned, after providing the $95,000 figure at the meeting for the winter season, Mr. Lee clarified that the total, the cash layout for the face value of the fee for the entire year is about $100,000. So most of the lion's share of the use of indoor facilities takes place during the winter season.
So you're
But
saying
that doesn't any that's only what the district bills, and that doesn't include what
Well, I'm asking about-
Mr. Rogers and Mr. McGarry, Dr. McGarry have been mentioning.
The short answer is what was in the presentation. We billed $48,000. That would be the hit to the district. If you're going to waive the fees, you're losing $48,000 in revenue that would be offsetting the expense. That's the bottom line. We're presenting there's a difference, right? The actual cost, we're talking about expense versus billing revenue and the offset into the budget. The only avenue for the district to gain or collect revenue, I should say, because it's not really gaining, we're losing in this scenario as it stands, is to not bill for that revenue, the use of facilities charge. You take that out of the budget, the net effect is $48,000. Mr. Desnoyer's point of the winter season, that's $48,000 as it was presented for the winter season alone, because that's where the lion's share of the cost is. The board put into the policy that outdoor use of facilities, fields, anything like that, there's no fee to use a field, a natural grass field. There's a fee to use a synthetic turf and the tracks. But if you use a baseball field or a grass soccer field, there's no charge. So that's why the cost is really on the winter sports, because the gyms do have a cost associated with them to use because of the actual staff needing to be there. So if I have a grass field, I don't need to unlock the grass field for you to get in. Whereas a gym, I have to unlock and let you in and monitor the use of the facility. So they're not paying for renting the field or building in any scenario. They're paying for the people to be there. We have to have employees there specific to their event. If we already have someone on site, like at the high school and at times at the middle school level, we're not charging because the district already has that cost. It would almost be as if we are double billing, to Dr. McGarry's point in the conversation we had with the youth groups. If we are sending an employee specifically to a building to unlock it for their use, that's the charge. And it's only the $17, which works out to $48,000. You would be removing $48,000 at a minimum, roughly, out of your budget. So if you want to call it $50,000 for round numbers for this conversation, that's roughly what you're looking at, is reducing the district's revenue in the budget by $50,000.
So two things. First is, we're talking about this policy, but we've already been sort of living through this policy and with multiple groups that paid according to the policy already this past year. And I just want to make sure we're not sort of muddying the waters, because I know that we have some groups that still have an unpaid balance. And that really should be a separate conversation, because there's a fairness issue. What we are discussing right now is the policy for the 23-24 year. Or at least we should not be discussing the policy for the 22-23 year unless we just also want to have that second conversation, because there's a fairness issue in these groups that already paid and the groups that haven't paid. So I don't know if we want to have that 22-23 school year conversation or not, but as I understand it, we're currently having a school year 23-24 conversation. And on the school year 23-24 conversation, my one sort of comment or question is, so there's this net pay issue if we have encourage the community groups to have their members apply to be recreation custodians. Would it work? I'm not even totally sure this would work, but I would be willing to somehow waive the difference, right? To sort of say, okay, hey, you're a community group, you are scrapping and doing it and putting it together, and you've gotten some bodies to help out. And so we don't want to penalize you, and so we will, we'll waive the part that isn't paid to that person, and that person hopefully contributes their earnings to the group, and then it's sort of like, yeah. So I can imagine that might be tricky or might not be possible, but that would be. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Look, and I don't want to sound coy. We're following the board's policy. If you want to make it so that there's a caveat that if you as a youth organization sign up to be an employee, to be that recreation custodian, you get an additional percentage off of the usage rate, then we're paying you, and that's on you what you do with the money after the fact. But you became a recreation custodian and you get 40% discount. Whatever the number may be, we can mathematically figure out. Yes. Is it possible? It is. Is it straightforward, easy? Does it complicate the process anymore? Yes. We're here to do, whatever the board wants to decide and how to process through this. We do our best to try and follow the policy and work through the actual procedure with all of the groups. But simply, yes, it's possible. Whether or not that's the best path forward or not, it's not for me to decide.
So the other piece to that is we also review what other school districts' what the costs are, and ours are among the lowest around for these costs. But again, to Craig's point, we'll do, obviously what the board would like us to consider in this process. I would be worried about contracting out services at some point too. So I think one of the things we offered, and I'll put that out for this conversation, we also offered creating our own Upper Darby youth organization under our umbrella, and then training our kids to be coaches, to kids to be refs, to reduce some of the costs. And we have some feedback. Marvin put that together, and we received the feedback tonight about how many of the youth organizations would like to come under. We would run our own youth organization and then have kind of a committee operating under that, and we would kind of control that, which would reduce those fees, because to, I think, Board President Brown's point, then it does become part of our operation as a school district, and we will build that into that consideration. But that's a whole another complicated discussion.
So I wanted to put that forward as one potential compromise, that to sort of allow for groups that are making as much effort as they can possibly make, that still doesn't maybe put us as much in the hole. But then I do maybe want to put out the conversation, are we right now having that 22-23 school year conversation? We are not. Just wanted to check.
That wasn't discussed at the youth group leaders meeting.
I apologize. It was, and there is an expectation that after today's meeting that some of these youth organizations would hear, if it's not tonight a decision, but soon, there are at least 2 organizations that are asking and emailed tonight in particular, wanting to know when a decision will be coming on the 22-23 cost. 2 organizations. The other organizations have paid or have a plan to pay, to Dr. Haig, to your point. But I do think that there are 2 conversations.
Okay, so let me amend this. The conversation we've had up till now, I would like to consider for going forward, meaning the board is considering potential changes to policy 707 going forward for 23-24 going forward. When we are done with that conversation, we will go back to the 2022-2023 winter season custodial fees, if the board's okay with that.
I'm okay with that, but can I ask a quick clarifying question on it?
Yes.
I know at least one of the groups, their fees are large because they booked more than they really needed. Is that true for both organizations or just the one?
I only know the one who continued to reach out, who later admitted that they did not communicate back and forth closing. Their understanding was you get a custodian anyway, so what's the problem? It's in your budget, and we explained it. There was an understanding that that's not the case. They then came back and claimed that there was far less hours that they actually used the gym, and they would like to only pay a bill for those hours, but we still sent somebody out. But there was only one organization that I'm aware of that contacted me and the board directly about the hours they feel that they should be charged.
Can we confirm that the other group, we think at least mostly used what they, if we could just find that, I just want to know. Sorry.
There has been a spreadsheet of this information provided for the board to review as well.
I certainly think we need to reduce the custodial fees, right? It's to the next to last option, however way we do that, I think is too high. And I've gotten those emails, as Dr. McGarry has, and those text messages about the fees being exorbitant, thousands of dollars. So however we can reduce those, we got to figure out a way to reduce it so that it's not cost prohibitive. The other option is still in my head as a viable option, at least I'd like it to be, but waiving the typical and normal custodial fees for the youth groups, which is why I asked about the overall effect of it. If you're telling me $50,000, my question is will that have an adverse effect on our budget if we absorbed $50,000 to waive the custodial fees in its entirety for the summer season or whatever, whichever, or the winter, I don't know, whichever season you said is the winter season, just for that, if we waived it in its entirety. I wanted to know, do we now go back to what we looked at earlier with our 1%? How would that affect our overall budget if we absorb $50,000? If you're telling me we could absorb that, we could afford it, then that should be a viable option. If not, then we figure out a way to reduce it so that it's affordable.
Just generally speaking, if we're going to make any kind of adjustment to the budget, you have two options: reduce expenditures or increase your revenue. So you could either, at the board's discretion, you would have the ability to try and go out with a higher tax increase to offset if you want to keep it at a net neutral on this year's budget or future years' budgets, or we would have to reduce expenditures from a different category and shift that expenditure or offset from the revenue over. I wouldn't advise against opening your budget for $50,000 when we're about to vote on it tonight, my personal opinion. But that's the reality of the situation when you're balancing a budget. Or, in that scenario, are you looking at, increasing the use of fund balance in conjunction with the budget? So going from, the $4.2 million use of fund balance to 4.225 or 50 rather, 250.
Okay. I understand your point, and thanks for explaining that. It's just such a small number, so I'm just trying to figure out the effect it would have, or how we could do it so that the problem goes away, and that's all.
I think when you're looking at $50,000, small is relative, right? We're looking at a $270 million budget. Do we make decisions when we go through the budget process to try and allocate, or when you look at adding a position, all of those things come into consideration. And yes, $50,000 out of $270 million is not astronomical, but on the other hand, I guess some would make that's a substantial amount of money. That's more than what a first-year teacher makes at Bachelor Step 1. So, it's all in how you look at it. Overall, yes, I would agree with you. $50,000 in comparison to a $270 million budget is not enormous, or as a percentage, it's a small percentage of a $270 million budget.
Right,
That's
and I'm
why
not
I'll
minimizing
leave
the number or saying that's minuscule. I'm just thinking of the use of it, and that would be to help youth-serving organizations, which helps the community. So I'm not discounting the amount, the number. I'm just saying, I just want to understand the effect if we, if we explored that option. That's
Sure.
all.
I guess to me, it's more qualitative than quantitative. Like, what value is this adding to the children's lives in the community? Like, I know we're talking about $50,000 and how much that is. It could buy a teacher, it can do all these things, but what value are these groups adding to the children's lives in our communities? And I think it's worth it.
No, well, we appreciate that, but what we're telling you is we have to make changes to the budget that's getting voted on tonight. Okay.
Can we, like, take a consensus on waiving the fees and adding it, I guess, into the fund balance, because it would be too complicated to change the tax increase at this late hour? Could we do a consensus on that? Because there's a lot of back and forth. I do want to say one caveat that I hope that we can add into the policy, that if they consistently, let's say there's one or two misses, that's okay, but perhaps, like, if they become consistent where they constantly do not show up, that they are charged the fee.
All right, direct,
Question I would ask Kyle, Don, if you don't mind. Kyle, as this question goes through, I just want to make sure we're not opening ourselves up to any practices that have already made agreements with other organizations related to fees. If we do this, well, we have to memorialize after Don goes, but just thinking about the fact that this is the direction, just looking at it from a policy standpoint, constituting the youth groups, the percentages, and allowing those fees to be waived, whereas we have agreements with other organizations, would that open us up to them getting the same access?
Yeah, potentially it could. You've got, I mean, you can't treat the different groups differently just because one of them says, I can or can't pay. But it sounds to me like what's being proposed here is that it's an across-the-board waiver where you'd be getting rid of the fees for all groups at the same time that fit into this category.
Right, I'm asking all youth groups that would fit into this category, would they be eligible to have their youth group fees waived?
I thought,
So
maybe I misunderstood, but
I just want to address your comment, Dan, and your question about the groups that you've already made things with. And I think the enactment of what we're trying to put in place would avoid that, because I think, to your credit, and let me finish. In the past, anybody that's yelled loud enough or complained loud enough, because they had this great big bill, you figured out a solution to help them. So you've made, you figured out a way to help them. So you've made a lot of side agreements. But if we put this in place, then there would be no need for that, because we would be waiving it and everybody would be treated the same way.
so I think the concern is actually more whether a group that doesn't fit into the category as we've defined it is going to end up saying, well, there's no realistic difference between us and them, and that is a real concern. There are certainly groups that are going to say that they're also, you've got 5 criteria, they fit 4 of the 5 or something like that. And they're going to say, look, we really ought to be able to get
But
that
I think
same
we've defined pretty clearly what a youth serving organization is, and right, don't we have correct me if I'm wrong, don't we have a requirement in there about a percentage of the kids being Upper Darby students? So I think we protect ourselves that way, right? Am I wrong?
I'm not saying that you're ultimately going to end up on the wrong side of this, but I am saying that you're going to be opening yourself up to the argument, and you're certainly going to be opening yourself up to those groups coming in and demanding to be treated the same as these other groups.
So, just to clarify, the policy is that organizations, that the residency requirement is not in the youth group section of the policy. In order to rent our facilities, the 50% of the 50% of the members essentially must be district residents. What is in the youth group section are, if you'd like, I can read it to you, but the requirements are one of the significant requirements is that the group is managed and where the activities are supervised by unpaid volunteers. And there are several groups that operate using district facilities that don't qualify as youth groups, with which we have negotiated separate agreements. So I'll leave it at that. If you'd like, I can read the section on youth groups directly from the policy.
I would just like us to make a consensus on whether we're going to waive the fees or not.
Craig, so let me get my questions out. So Craig, I need an explanation on the issues, I would assume problems of gross versus net pay. So that's my first question. These three options, and I want to hear from Neil and administration, the three options suggested during the brainstorming session. How was that received by the groups that were there? Were they really kind of gung-ho about that? Were they kind of really resistant to the options of becoming recreation custodians and things like that? And this idea of bringing them under the school district youth groups, I assume that was raised. I don't know if that was raised in this session that Neil and the administration was at, but if it was, I'd like to hear how that was received and how long that would take. I also want to say, I do agree with Ed that this board and this community has to decide if funding this piece, this custodial fees piece, is something that should just be built into our budget, right? I agree with Director Murphy-Morrissey about how there is a huge benefit to these facilities, and as we improve them, there'll be more benefit. So that it's not a constant thing every every season, we do have to find a solution to for some of these costs for some of these groups. And it may be that the most direct way is building it into the budget. So that'll circle back to Director Mitchell's request to her request. But I do want to hear gross versus net pay issues. What are those issues? These three brainstorming items, how were they received? I want to hear from Neil and the admins. And then what's the ETA on bringing the groups in under the district's banner? I'm done.
So the gross versus net is just like any employee, quite frankly, in the United States, I guess, or if you want to make it more specific to the state of Pennsylvania, you have your gross wages, and then taxes come out, and what actually hits your bank account, the net pay, is less than what your hourly rate is. So their point is you're charging the group, but $17 an hour. I volunteer I get employed as a recreation custodian. The district's now paying the hourly rate, but that's not what actually is hitting my bank account. I may only net out $9 an hour, right? So I can only donate back the cash that actually hits my bank account. So I think that was to Meredith's point of coming up with a discount for somebody who opts to be a recreation custodian, because you would be offsetting essentially the taxes they're paying on their net pay. And I want to be clear too, we charge $17 an hour. That's not the hourly rate that we're paying custodians either, because the district has to pay the fringe side of FICA, PSERS, all the different rates that, so we're charging higher than the hourly rate paid to our recreation custodians. Okay, so their rate's like around $12, and let's say they net out $9, they're out $3 an hour, let's say. And they're erroneous numbers. They're not actually calculated in front of me right now. That's that concept.
All right, so point of clarification. So if they came in and worked as a recreation custodian for their group, we wouldn't have to hire someone to go do that. They would be doing it.
They would be doing it, and we'd be paying them. Quite frankly, full disclosure, one of their comments back was, don't even pay me. I don't want to be your recreation custodian. Let me be a volunteer. Let me be a district volunteer. I'll do it. You're not paying me. and you're not charging my group. So if I sign up to be a volunteer and I show up as your recreation custodian unpaid, you waive the fees for our group. The issue with that becomes liability concerns, whether or not you have somebody who's now in control of access in and out of a building who's not a district employee. So you have safety, security issues, and liability issues. I know we talk about this a lot. We improve the facilities, and people are gonna want to use the assets that exist in the district. They will age quicker the more you use them. I also want to make it very, very clear, and I know that I sit here tonight. I give a presentation on our budget, and I know everyone here looks at me as I am the CFO of the school district, and my responsibility is to be fiscally responsible. That doesn't change the fact that personally, I do think there is value to the youth organizations. I grew up in the area. I played sports here. It molded me into who I am today. And without that, I don't know where I would be. So I'm taking a stance from a financial perspective at times, but understand I do know and realize, and I believe that our youth organizations are very important to this community. So the point of what Dr. McGarry brought up of creating our own Royal Athletic program and make it an amazing service to the school district would likely, or to the community and the school district, would likely cost us more than $50,000, potentially, unless we have creative ways of offsetting the revenue. But that would be an amazing add to the community and a major headache to do as well. But that was actually our idea together as people who grew up here playing, sports in the area. If that's the path that the board actually comes out and says, if you really want to make an impact and you want to serve the youth, that actually may be a more direct use of how we do it. Trust me when I say that will not go over well with all organizations. We already know that because the facilities would be used by Royals Athletic or whatever the group may be. Upper Darby, yes. And I only say that because I know to a comment made earlier, I'm being asked a lot about the financial side of it. Please don't take it as I don't realize what this is an impact, socially, emotionally, and how it helps our children. But I'm trying to answer as direct as possible from the financial side. As far as Director Mitchell's comment on how you would account for it in the budget, I wouldn't adjust our current budget that's up for a vote tonight. We have contingency funds that are built in for unknowns. Always, we would just chalk it up in the next year's budget as this would be considered one of those unknowns. It would come from the contingency, but we would absolutely include it in future budgets. When we build the budget, as we always put on the slide, the assumptions that we have as of June 20th. Well, as of building the budget, this was an unknown. So no, I would not let it throw off the budget you're looking to vote on tonight. But it would absolutely have to be taken into consideration any change. So that was the feedback as well from the groups.
What was the response for these brainstorming items, the response from the groups that you were in the meeting with? Were they really into it? Not so much?
So Marvin was kind enough to reach out and get feedback from the idea of an umbrella organization. From the 11 that we heard back from, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all said yes, they'd be interested in forming an umbrella organization with the school district. One organization said under no circumstances would they want to join with us, and I'm not going to bring that name up here.
I'm talking about the brainstorming idea, the becoming recreation custodians, scheduling.
Yeah, I think
estimated bills.
I think estimated bills was a positive. I think upfront costs, understanding that was a positive, but essentially the common theme was reducing the fees below $17 or to waive them completely was the general theme. By the end of the conversation, it was to either drastically reduce it or, my opinion, get rid of them completely. There was a conversation about why can't you hire just one person to go around and open and close, but it's not realistic to have somebody go. And they understood that after we explained it. They were good questions. They were engaged. The people who came to the meeting were not argumentative, or it was a great conversation. I thought it was productive, and they were positive. I think it was just these are expensive fees, and we get it. Cost of umpires, cost of refs, cost of a basketball or a baseball, it's going up tremendously. My takeaway was, can you eliminate the cost of these custodial fees for us? If not, can we just be hired as volunteers to open it on our own organization and then hold us accountable if something goes wrong. That was my takeaway.
Of the 3 brainstorming options listed, there was the most support for estimated bills at the start of the season or year. The other 2 options were, yes, we can do that and it may help.
I think an idea is to address these fees, next year's fees, but work in the direction of this umbrella organization. That's just, I don't know how anybody else feels about that. I think, because as you said, Craig, there are other fees in these groups, umpires, refs, that's the same thing basically, coaches, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe that's what some of these, it could be, I don't know. But maybe that's something that these groups might appreciate having managed or something like that. So we may want to look at that. And I appreciate everybody's time and everybody sitting in the heat.
Craig, this comment is for you, or question is for you. Is there a way to cap or max a building? So say somebody wants to use Highland Park, and it's like 10 different organizations or whatever. Is there a way to cap it so that no one has autonomy over the gym for an entire season, or no one has that we don't have so many people using the facility that we can't get it cleaned or get it locked up, or is there a way to cap a facility?
So, I mean, we could creatively come up with whatever plan the board would like us to explore. I will say that's happened. So over, coming out of COVID and all the work that we've done in the facilities, Beverly Hills for a summer, because the windows were being done, that was shut down. And gym floors and different projects that have happened, we've actually had scenarios where gym space is not available at all the buildings. And Marvin has met with the groups and had to have that conversation and basically give and take and almost negotiate who was going to have the facilities when, because certain organizations definitely use certain buildings way more than others. I don't know if an option is your first X number of hours is waived, and beyond that you have to pay the fee. There's all different, that would be reverse capping it, right? You get a cap up to a waived amount, and then beyond that, it's becoming excessive, and you're going to have to pay the $70 or $17 or whatever it may be. But again, that's for the board to consider. If you want to change the policy, we're going to follow it, and so it could be an option.
My concern is just that if the board wills to eliminate fees, and we open it up to more youth organizations to want to use the buildings, and then do we have the capacity to manage that?
Yes, that could actually, I would imagine if we wholesale waive fees for all youth groups, you're absolutely going to see an uptick in who's coming to use the facilities, how often. You likely will have a scheduling concern, and we would have to navigate that.
That was the point of coming together as one, because right now there's competition for the gyms. When Aronimink gets up and running, that's going to be another place to fight over, who's going to get it, how are they going to use it, versus if it's one organization, you can schedule it all one way versus competing interests. That was the thought.
I was just trying to keep the extra work off of you all by having the one umbrella organization, but also I know some youth organizations aren't going to want to give up their autonomy to come under us.
Yeah.
Because right now they have some money because they can write grants or they can fundraise, and once they come under us, the whole cost comes.
Yes. It was also discussed it was also mentioned during the meeting that the lion's share of youth group use is participants from one area of the district. So there are areas in the district for various reasons that don't have many groups using our facilities.
Yeah, just point of order. I hope we're not talking about the Royal Athletics tonight. It's not on the agenda. Although I think it's an excellent idea and whatever, but I know we're talking this long and hard, but the reason why the district started charging was because we had a problem. We had certain groups overbooking the facilities and they were like legacy groups. They booked out the facilities, and no one else could use the facilities. So the district, we brainstormed on it, we talked about it at public meetings, and we came up with charging just the custodial fees to youth serving. At that time, it was just sports organizations. I just want everyone to understand, this is also encompassing, scout groups, any, youth serving organizations that meet our definition. So, I mean, one of the reasons, and that has helped to curtail some of the overbooking, correct, Mr. Rogers? So I do stand, I wanted to say again, that I have a concern about waiving the fees and then people not showing up for the time that they've booked, now that it's a free thing, that they have no responsibility for. I am very concerned about that. While I think all the youth serving organizations are doing admirable work with kids, I just want to reiterate that the fees for kids in the community likely are not going to be reduced. The cost of uniforms go up, the fees that they have to their organizations that they're part of, all those are going up exponentially. While I think this would help them, it may not increase participation of youth in the community if that's what the board is thinking. And I think that's why Dr. McGarry was talking about the Royal Athletics, which I think should go on maybe another agenda. But we have been talking about this for almost an hour at this point, and I want to hear from the community members. I know there's a few here that may want to speak on it before we, and I know I said I want to hear what people, it seems like the will of the board is to waive, but I don't know. And I know that we won't really say what we want to say until after we hear from the community, but I sort of want to see it, should we keep talking about this? Is there enough of us that want to waive the fee? That's all. And, just a history lesson, I don't want to see what happened historically happen again.
Yeah, just to clarify for the benefit of the public, we're not going to be asking for consensus until after we receive that public comment, and then we review the agenda items, and then each one we will say, is there a consensus? Just so that no one is assuming that we're concluding anything at this moment. It's important that we move on, I believe, so that we can hear from you and then move this process forward.
Before we move on, I just want to just comment on what Director Mitchell said. I don't think they're mutually exclusive items. I don't think I don't think we have to waive the fees or put something in the policy that, like a punishment or a ramification if they use the facilities, book it, and don't use it. So I think we can protect ourselves by putting something in the policy in addition to waiving the fees. We want to take care of people that do the right thing.
That's what I suggested.
Okay. I thought you were saying either or. Sorry.
No,
Okay.
I said I don't want to see
Okay.
what happened in the
Got it.
past, but.
All right. Now is the time for public comment. As Dr. McGarry instructed earlier, priority will be given to those physically present. If you would like to make comment, please come up to the mic, announce your name, your address, and the specific agenda item that you would like to make comment on. Are there any takers for this evening?
Good evening. My name is Dietrich Dorsey. I am the president of Highland Park Kirkland Athletic Association. My address is 125 South Pennock Avenue in Upper Darby. I really want to thank everyone present for giving this issue the amount of time that you have. And the issue is the use of facilities. The questions that have come up, most of our concerns have been answered. Again, you've been very diligent in considering this, and we appreciate it. The only question I have that hasn't been answered, it was brought up by Director Mitchell, is I understand why the policy changed, which I didn't know, so thank you for answering that. But before 2022, that $50,000 cost, how was it balanced in the budget? How was it covered?
So prior to 2022, the 2 years prior to that, were actually a waiver due to COVID. Prior to that, so 2019 before,
Right.
was actually, there was a joint venture between the township and the school district where we had a joint recreation department that all of this was housed out of. So all uses of facilities throughout the township, Upper Darby Township, were managed by the recreation office, where the employee was paid by the township. We actually paid a fee to the township to cover a portion of costs for the recreation office, but it was run by the township, so there was a joint venture there. After 2019, there was a decision made to actually separate that relationship very specific to use of facilities and recreation. So that office actually housed daycare, use of facilities, and a couple other areas within the district. So that's how it was handled before.
Okay. So with that, I appreciate that answer. That makes sense. But I'm obviously in agreement with the idea that it's a community service and that impact on the budget in the grand scheme of things is not worth not having these organizations be able to function. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers, would you mind reviewing the agenda items one more time for this evening and letting us know where a consensus needs to be made, please?
Sure. So we had 3 items tonight, each of which will require board action. The first up is the 23-24 final budget presentation. I ask if the board would like to move that forward for a vote immediately following this meeting.
Is there a consensus, everyone?
Yes.
The second item is the request to name a school district facility, or in this case, rename the Aronimink Library, and the board will have to make a decision on that as well.
Is there a consensus to allow the administration to have a conversation with the applicant? Oh,
So we just, based on the way the policy is written for naming of district facilities, as we explained at the beginning of the presentation, we bring the request to the committee chairs. The committee chairs bring it to the board. The board then has to make a decision on how they would like to move forward, and it's actually written out in the language that you would give me as the CFO the directive, if this were to be moved forward, to do a cost analysis of what it would cost to rename the facility. Based on the comments made during the presentation, it sounded like the board wanted to move in a direction of a different type of memorializing of this individual. So if that's where we're at, then I would ask for that directive, essentially. So this, unlike some of our other decisions, like the budget of moving something for a specific vote, this is in regards to how would you like to proceed with closing out this specific request.
all right. So is there a consensus to allow the administration to have the necessary leeway to make sure Mr. Bamberg is properly memorialized in some kind of a plaque or whatever is appropriate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The
Thank you.
third item, policy 707, use of school facilities, is board action. What we're asking for here, based on the presentation, is whether or not there's a consensus from the board to move forward with a language change to policy 07 in regards to what our discussion was, the service charge for youth organizations. So the consensus would be whether or not we're essentially opening up the language in 707 as we move forward in the August board meeting.
All right. Is there a consensus from the board?
Yes.
Yeah, my understanding is that you'd be essentially looking at policy 707 to make revisions for the 23-24, and then you would have a separate conversation about outstanding fees that have been questioned for the 22-23.
So we would have to have another reading of the policy at the next meeting. And I still don't have an answer if the board wants to wait, like if the conversation is about, it is going to be a change in the language of waiving fees. Is that what we're all doing?
Director Mitchell, we're at that point where we're reaching a consensus. We're just breaking through some of what people might be still confused on.
So for options requiring board action, one is reduce and one is waive.
Waive, correct.
Both of those require a change to the language.
In my personal opinion, and Director Desnoyers can speak to it, but if you're changing the policy,
Let
you're
me
either,
finish. Let me finish. Do we need to say, let me ask Kyle, do we need to say one or the other? They're both changing the language, but do we need to specify one or the other?
So there, as I understand your question, one of them is prospective and one is retrospective. Is that?
No.
No. One, recommend the administration reduce custodial fees. The other is waive typical and normal custodial fees for youth groups.
Oh,
Both require, both
Board
are a
action.
change to the policy, but I prefer one over the other. So how do I speak to that?
say it, man.
Should we be polling the board so we know everyone's feelings or not? I
Yeah,
mean,
Well, there's-
I mean,
but there's
this-
more than two
the-
options,
The
right?
purpose of getting consensus here is to find out what the board generally supports. And if that means that you're breaking it into multiple pieces, then fine, you're breaking it into multiple pieces. But the idea is still to find out and give direction to the administration as to how you want to proceed from this point. And if, it sounds like you've got, at least as you're stating it, there are these two choices that you have to go with.
Well, three.
So, or there may be more. So, so you need to decide what you want to do, and why don't you start by saying what you would want to see happen?
Okay. Well, for this year, I like the brainstorming options for the 20, I don't know if they can even work for 2022, 2023. I have no idea. But for what's come to pass, I like the brainstorming options. Going forward, if we're going to update the policy, my preference is reducing, not waiving, because I'm just a big believer people have to have skin in the game. That's it.
Yeah, I also wanted to emphasize I feel like we glossed over the idea of reducing rather than waiving, which kind of became an all or nothing thing. And I feel like reducing would be a good common ground. And as someone with a background in economics, you give people things for free, they don't always treat them as well. And so I feel like that could be a good middle ground.
All right.
And to Rachel's previous point, we could, that reducing or waiving, whatever it ends up being, that should be null and void for groups that don't show up. And I don't think you really, maybe you get one freebie, but I don't really see why. Like, if you don't show up, I don't understand why you get waived fees. Like, that shouldn't happen,
All right, I think there is a suggestion from Vice President Fields to individually get. All right, so we're having a consensus on one of the two choices.
We're polling.
Polling based on, right, so the directive is giving administration the permission to either reduce or waive, or one.
You're asking everybody.
Oh, okay, what their preference is of that. All right, so I'll start from this end then, taking the consensus. Mine is to waive the fee.
Mine too is to waive the fee. We haven't heard how we would reduce the fee. What would reduced fees look like? So I guess waive the fees.
My option is to either reduce or waive the fee. I am not in favor of completely letting go of the fee, especially if people aren't going to show up.
How do we quantify her
You said
vote?
reduce or waive,
It
but
needs
then
to
you
be-
said something that made it sound like you didn't like waive. So we're just to
Yeah, I don't like waiving the fee
Okay,
completely.
so reduce or keep.
Yeah.
I'm in favor for waiving with a, just because I'm tired of we've had it many, 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 many times, and I think it is a benefit to the youth organizations. But I'm with Meredith. If they miss it, I would say one. One would be enough for me to, and then that would be it.
You already voted? Okay. So my vote is the exact same as Director Mitchell, to waive the fee, but add something to the language to penalize if they miss it.
And that is the option I choose as well. Waive the fee, but there is a penalty if there are no-shows.
Did you vote? You already voted?
I already said I would
Okay.
vote, I would support reducing.
Okay.
All right, so is the administration clear on how the board would like to proceed?
Yes. Yes, I'm clear. I'll say it back based on my therapy and training that I go through. Your direction is to look at the board policy with the policy liaisons to change policy 707 to have language that says that those organizations that qualify as youth-serving organizations in accordance with the policy will pay no service charge fee or rental fee unless they no-show, and then they'll be charged based on a no-show or communication.
Well, we already waived the rental fees. This is the custodial fee.
And I'm just reiterating and making sure that we're all on the same clear pace, that that's already free, and that we're keeping that same language, and now that's part of what we're talking about.
Also, in consideration for the policy, that we consider caps on spaces so that we're not overextending ourselves. Consideration.
One other thing, I know in previous meetings, we had discussed a concern about the need for the district to clean their facilities, to manage their facilities, to do improvements on the facilities. And I would hope that that the board would agree that that would be more of an administrative function of when you need to shut down the rental space on a school for improvements. And it would be your discretion. I don't think that should be board oversight. That's really a district administration function, in my opinion.
The first approval for a use of any facility in the district, it goes to the building level administrator. So if they have a use for the site that is in conflict, then it actually gets denied up front. So, we do have that ability administratively, so your interpretation is accurate.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of remind everyone of that.
Right. I appreciate everyone's patience that we had as we've needed to definitely have these very important conversations, but I hand the meeting back over as soon as he's ready to President Brown.
Thank you. Dr. Desnoyers.
I do want to hear about the umbrella organization for these groups in a future meeting, so.
Sure.
Okay, I think we covered everything. A motion is in order for the adjournment of the Finance and Operations Committee meeting.
So moved.
So moved.
Meeting adjourned.